Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at 5 stories about paranormal experiences. We've got a really interesting mix this time.
Definitely a lot of variety.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be really interesting to kind of see what common threads emerge as we go through them.
hmm
Are there any recurring themes or patterns that we can identify? So we've got everything from a creature impersonating a family pet
Yeah.
to a spectral figure with glowing red eyes.
Classic.
Yeah, exactly. And even a shared nightmare about a menacing figure.
I always find those shared dream stories so fascinating.
Me too. Like,
Yeah.
what's going on there,
Uh,
right? Like, how can two people have the exact same dream, especially when it's something so vivid and disturbing?
It really makes you question the nature of reality and consciousness.
No kidding.
Before we get into the first story, please subscribe and like. Help me. There is a man pretending to be my dog. My name is Sydney. I am 13 years old. My best friend's name was Honey. She was a 9-year-old Goldie. The man pretending to be Honey looks like he is around 40 years old. He wears her skin and my family believes it is her. They brought him home 3 weeks ago. My mom cried when she saw him sitting on the porch. My dad dropped to his knees, calling him our sweet girl as he scratched behind Honey's floppy ear, reaching his white, pink human ear. He didn't seem to notice how Honey's ear was slightly falling with each scratch. Danny, my little brother, hugged his neck and buried his face in the man's skin, rubbing the rolls of his back like it was fur. But it's not Honey. It's a naked man wearing my best friend's fur. Honey didn't walk like that. She didn't stumble over her own paws or, well, hands and knees, because that's what they are. Hands and knees. He crawls awkwardly, shifting his weight like he's never done it before. Like he's learning how to be a dog. The worst part is, I think he believes it. He barks when my parents tell him to, his deep and manly voice sounding nothing like my Honey. He growls when Danny plays tug-of-war, getting in a dog-like playful position as drool drips from his chin and his body is on full display. He even wags what's left of her tail. It's unsettling. It makes me cry. He sits by the door when the leash comes out, painting with this strange, unnatural smile like he's excited. Like he wants to be walked. I tried to tell my mom. I told her it wasn't Honey, but she just stroked his head and said, "Don't say that, Sydney. Look how happy she is to be home." The first night he got here, I heard scratching outside my window. I peeked through the curtains and saw him in the backyard, digging with his bare hands. His nails were caked with dirt, and he was muttering to himself between shallow, panting breaths. I stayed up all night listening to him claw at the ground. The next morning, I found out why. When I went outside, there was a fresh hole near the fence where he'd been digging. It was sloppy, dirt scattered everywhere, and right at the bottom of it was Honey's old collar. It was torn, the leather shredded, and the metal buckle was stained dark red. I didn't hear him coming. "You shouldn't have gone out here," he said. His voice was low, and when I turned around, he was crouched by my legs, his head tilted like he was trying to understand me. His hands were dirty, trembling as he reached for me, but I bolted before he could get any closer. "Honey, come here, girl." My dad called out, and he went back to barking and tail wagging, trotting to him on hands and knees. But not before looking at me with his tongue out. Since then, he won't leave me alone. He follows me around the house, sniffing at my toes and licking my legs. Anytime I'd yell at him to stop, my family would tell me I've turned into a dog abuser. They'd make me pet him, and he would bark happily. He sits outside my door at night, whining softly, scratching at the wood. Last night, he finally pushed the door open. "Scoot over," he growled, climbing into my bed without waiting for me to answer. He curled up beside me, his knees pulled to his chest, and rested his head on my pillow. He smelled like dirt and sweat and something I don't want to name. I didn't sleep at all. I just lay there, stiff and silent, as he muttered and whimpered in his sleep, his breath warm against the back of my neck. I could hear every human word that left his lips, and yet my family doesn't believe me. They really think it's Honey. I am the only one mourning my best friend. I decided to try taking off his skin. I grabbed onto the fur on his back and tried to rip it off during family dinner so that my whole family could see. But it didn't work. He let out a high-pitched whimper and I tugged multiple times. Did he glue the fur onto his skin? I think I ripped off a little, which is why he started bleeding a bit. I got grounded for abusing the dog. At least they won't let me around him while I'm grounded, but I can hear him breathing at my door during the night. And sometimes he stares at me through my window from the backyard. I asked for curtains, but my mom said they'll come in 2 weeks from now. She ordered online. I try to ignore his face pressed against my window. I try to go to bed, but I'm so scared. I think he's waiting for me, and I don't know what he's going to say or do when he's finally able to come back into my room. I don't think he's going to stop, and I'm scared. Now for the second story. Woke up to my boyfriend staring down at me with red glowing eyes. So this happened quite a few years ago when I was about 20 to 21 years old, so almost a decade ago now, but despite so much time passing by, I have never been able to shake this memory or explain it. So I was spending the night at my boyfriend's place one night, as I often did during our relationship. He lived in the spare finished room in his aunt's basement, and from the very first moment I stepped into it, I sensed weird energy, but I told myself that the feeling was just because I was in the basement, underground, and we were the only 2 people down there. So I figured I was just being creeped out by all of the associations with basements being a bit spooky. Well, this one night, something woke me up. I'm not sure what it was, but it didn't feel natural, like I didn't wake up because I was uncomfortable or to switch positions or because I had to use the bathroom or was thirsty, etc. It felt like something had woken me up and pulled me out of my sleep. As my eyes opened, I stared into the face of my partner, who was standing next to and slightly over the bed, still as a statue, with piercing red, glowing eyes piercing mine, with a twisted expression on his face. I can't explain the look exactly, but it was kind of a mixture of a blank, expressionless stare with a slight menacing edge and dark energy to it. Maybe it was the red glowing eyes that made him appear menacing. I'm not sure, but it freaked me TF out, especially because my boyfriend was actually sleeping soundly right next to me, separating me and the glowing-eyed version of him standing right next to the bed, inches away from the real him, staring down at me. I moved my body closer to him to feel his solidness and to make sure that the man sleeping next to me was the real him, and I nuzzled my head and face into his body and closed my eyes, forcing myself back to sleep. I never told him what I had saw in the morning when he woke up to get ready for work and kind of just convinced myself that I had simply dreamed the experience and that it was a hallucination. But after all of these years, I still can't shake the memory of it because I know it wasn't something my mind just made up, and I know I was awake and experienced this red, glowing-eyed version of him for real. But after many Google searches, I haven't been able to stumble across anything that could explain what I saw and why. Does anyone here have any ideas as to who/what it was that took the form of my boyfriend that night? Has anyone ever experienced anything similar to this at all? Please tell me I'm not crazy, lol.
The third story. I used to see a dark figure until an old man made it go away. So when I was 14, during the summer of 2018, I was spending some time at my grandparents' house. During the afternoon, I liked to go into the backyard and play some football, which was always fine until one day I kicked the ball into this part of the yard that has a little corridor that leads to the front yard of the house. I went down to pick up the ball and I was bringing myself up in the corner of my eye. I could make up this sort of dark figure peeking at me from the end of the corridor. But when I looked at it directly, it disappeared. I did not think much of it since this is quite common and could be mistaken as a shadow from something else. The next day came and I totally forgot about what had happened, but then as I walked out into the backyard to go play football, I saw the figure again, in the corner of my eye, at the start of the corridor peeking at me. Now I was about 172 centimeters at that age, but that thing must have been at least 200 centimeters. I could make out his hands holding on to the wall, and its face, that had nothing on it, just pure black. This one genuinely frightened me. I jolted back, and as I looked in its direction it disappeared. It was in the corner of my eye, but it looked so real that I thought it was my sister playing some sick prank on me. I even went to look into the corridor, and walked all the way to the front of the house to see if anyone was there, but there was no sign of anyone. I didn't tell anyone since I thought it was just all in my head, until the next day, when I was playing hide and seek with my sister, and as I walked to the driveway and looked at the gate I saw the figure, not in the corner of my eye, quite literally 15 meters in front of me, and for about half a second I saw it trying to crawl over the gate, and it looked like it was trying to reach for me, but I was too far away. It was very bulky, completely dark and had no face, but after that half second it just disappeared. I was so in shock since I had never had any sort of paranormal activity before that. I went to my granny and told her what I had seen. Now for context, this was in Portugal, and we are Roman Catholic, and she then said that I had to go see this old man that was going to pray for me. The next day we drove there, which was in another village like 30 minutes away from where we were. We stopped at his house and he told us to walk into this little room in his house that was full of crosses, pictures of Jesus, saints and Mary, like enough to literally cover all the walls. I then explained everything to him, and he told me that it doesn't necessarily mean it is an evil being, and it could be a symbol of someone that wanted to reach out to me, like someone that hadn't talked to me in a long time, and wanted to see me again. He then read out a very simple prayer and said I could leave. After that moment I never saw anything like that again. It has been 6.5 years since and I still have no clue what that could have been. Does anyone have a clue what that being could have been? And was that old man right?
Fourth story. Please subscribe if you are loving this channel so far. Me and my sister had the same dream. One night 5 or 6 years ago, I woke up in a fever after an odd dream. I came downstairs from my room at about 4 in the morning sweating profusely, and I found my older sister Tori sitting in a chair watching some chick flick, obviously not being able to sleep as there was no good reason to be awake at that time. She said she was confused why I was up, so I told her my weird dream that made me have a panic attack in my sleep. My dream was set in Cracker Barrel where Tori had worked. I was sitting down in a chair at a table in the middle of the room eating and seeing Tori waiting at other tables. After an hour, a man sat down 2 tables from me. He was wearing a black suit and a very flat black fedora. A waitress had served him water, then passed her duties to Tori. Tori made her way to the table he had sat at, getting him a refill of water. He then began to speak in tongues, and she looked up from the water she was pouring to look at his face. She had tensed up like an animal backed into a corner. Dropping the glass, then running off to the bathroom, I was confused. The man had started to turn where I could see his large, deep yellow eyes staring at me to the ground with a huge smile on his face like he enjoyed his undoubtedly wicked presence. I then woke up. Halfway through this story, Tori had gotten a weird expression on her face. This said, "Okay, I need to wake Mom." She ran to Mom and Dad's room, knocking loud. Mom snapped, "What?" after just lately being deep into sleep. Tori had said it was important as I was still confused on what was going on. Then Tori told my dream to Mom, then said to me, "It is exactly like my dream from a few nights ago." Tori also told me it was from her perspective. Mom was more scared than what I thought was reasonable. We took this as a sign that she should quit, as there was apparently weird stuff happening with people at Cracker Barrel already. The people had started to get irritable and she was on her way out anyways. The next morning, Tori put in her 2 weeks' notice. We felt relieved about this, mostly for Tori, as I would be terrorized by dreams. The next night after my sister sent in the notice, I had a dream in which a black hat man, which is what I started calling him, had killed a town of people, stringing them in trees with metal wires. He had also begun to look less like a man than he already did and carried a sign that had the paint scratched off in a specific way. I had these dreams until the 2 weeks were up and they had not resurfaced since. Me and Tori still find new details every once in a while. Fifth story. The infamous Gap Road of Oklahoma. My grandmother told my father of a story that she experienced when she was a child, who later passed the story down to me when I was a kid. It is a stretch of road just off the freeway west of Bartlesville in northern Oklahoma, where locals talk of dark myths of everything from a demon called Catman that lingers at night to a weird phenomenon called Gravity Hill. But these terrifying myths don't compare to what my grandmother swears is a very real and very tragic story that she experienced growing up. My grandmother was around 8 or 9 years old during the 1950s when one day her and her 3 friends left the house to go explore and play in the woodlands in Ochalata, Oklahoma, which was about a 10-minute drive to a hidden stretch of dirt road at the time called Gap Road. Probably no more than a couple of miles, this piece of road has had an extremely haunting past. During the 1920s, one of Oklahoma's worst incidents took place, which many would know as the Tulsa race riots, where innocent Black Americans were murdered. These riots spilled over into the neighboring town of Bartlesville, where many victims were kidnapped and taken to a large ominous tree just off the bend of the main freeway where they were lynched. The official death count my grandmother told my dad was around 16, but she said it could have been as high as 40. While they were playing, they'd worked their way up along the road, all the while blissfully unaware that the road would take them to the site of the massacre. They stopped at the tree where it took place because it stood out from all the others. It was in the middle of the summer, yet there wasn't a single leaf on it. It loomed ominously taller than the other trees and gave off a very negative vibe. One of my grandmother's friends then spotted what looked like a sharpened stick, as if someone had tossed it up towards the tree and it got caught between the branches. He climbed up and tossed it down, and the 4 looked it over before coming to the conclusion that it was probably used to poke the victims as they were strangled to death to see if they were still alive. And when they all died, they tossed it up into the tree only for it to be discovered by them. They made jokes about it, either out of racism or to make light of a dark situation. My grandmother would never tell me which is which when I asked her as a grown man, other than her not wanting to think about it. However, she did tell me one thing led to another, and they all suggested she take it home with her. She agreed, maybe to appear cool in front of her friends. She took it back with her later that night and sat it in her bedroom and went about business as usual until it was time to go to bed. That was when she said the real horror started. She awoke almost past 11 p.m. when she heard the sounds of knocking on her window that came at quick succession 3 times. Tunk, tunk, tunk. She'd pulled the sheets up over her head because she was afraid to look out the window. She peeked lightly just to see the spear where she'd left it leaning against the corner by her bedroom door when she pulled the covers back over. Tunk, tunk, tunk. The knocks are slightly louder than the last. She got the courage to lower the blanket past her eyes, only to feel her skin grow pale and a pit in her stomach formed. She swore to me, a woman now in her mid to late 70s, that the spear went from leaning against the corner of the room to being on the floor next to her bed with the sharpened end pointing at the window. She didn't even know it moved, almost as if it had floated when she wasn't looking was how she described it. That whole night she told me that the sounds on the window continued, and periodically the spear would end up somewhere else in her bedroom. And she blamed herself feeling cold mainly on her being very scared, but I wondered later if the haunted and tormented souls were attached to that spear that were still suffering decades later. When the morning came, she told me she didn't wait to get breakfast and raced into town as quickly as she could to a payphone in town where she'd call her friends frantically to come to her house and get the spear. When they arrived confused, she didn't bother explaining to them why she wanted it gone. She'd doubt they'd believe her anyways, so she told them to take it and throw it into the Connie River. The fear on my grandma's face was enough for them to comply. They took the spear from her bedroom and walked a little further into the woods where the Connie River was and threw the spear in it. Watching it float on down, they left to tell my grandmother that it was gone. She didn't experience anything else like that growing up, but it's a story she told me that made her believe there was something more beyond our realm that made her the superstitious woman she is today.
The final story. An entity stalked someone I knew. 25 years later, I'm still searching for answers. I had come home sometime in the fall of 2000 and noticed my mother was visibly upset. She did not outwardly express her distress. Instead, she stared at nothing in particular, completely stoic. And it was in her eyes that I could tell something very disturbing had clouded her mind, shook her to her core. I approached her and asked her what was wrong, fearing that something may have happened to my dad or one of my brothers. She finally met my eyes and said, "Steve!" Her voice shuddered. It took me a few seconds to recall the name as I was relieved it was not my dad or brothers. I then asked her what had happened. She took a moment and said, "Something terrible. Before we proceed any further, I would like to take you back to June of 1999 because it was at this time that I met Steve. Unlike some kids at my high school, I had no summer job, so my mornings were open. But much to my dismay, I was assigned to drive my mother to work bright and early one day. She did make me feel better as she explained that I was not required to drive her all the way to work. I only had to drop her off at her friend May's house a few blocks away. From there, Steve would be driving them to their workplace since he worked close by. As a 16-year-old at the time, I was selfishly delighted since that meant I could crawl back into bed. It was on our way to May's house that my mother told me about Steve. He is the eldest of 4 children. His parents had 2 daughters after he was born and then another son. Both of his parents worked long hours at low-paying jobs. Steve was more than happy to help out the family by contributing what he made from his job at a local garage. On top of that, Steve took excellent care of his siblings by adopting the role of a parent. He cooked, cleaned, and drove his siblings to school to ensure they got there safely. He was even able to make time for his longtime girlfriend. My mother also emphasized how popular he was among his many friends. "He is the perfect son," my mother concluded. Admittedly, I rolled my eyes as I took this to be one of my mother's ploys to make me act more responsibly as I entered adulthood. We reached May's house after a short drive. As we approached, I could see May, Steve, and Steve's girlfriend waiting for us by Steve's car. A large smile creased my mother's face as she saw Steve, which only annoyed me even more. "Come meet him," she said through her big grin. I exited my car intending to resent Steve. But surprisingly, all that changed when he introduced himself with a warm handshake and a big, friendly smile. He congratulated me on completing the 10th grade. I looked up at him as he spoke and gauged him to be in his late 20s or early 30s. He was tall, good-looking, and well-built from his years of labor in the garage. I could tell he was someone who could take care of himself physically. Another thing apparent to me was the affection he and his girlfriend had for one another. He had one arm tenderly curled around her waist, and her adoring gaze locked on him as he spoke. As I pulled away in my car with the thought of my warm bed waiting for me, I could not help but momentarily admire Steve. I mean, he got the looks, the girl, and the car. In the eyes of a teenage boy, it seemed he had everything. Tragically, that all changed beginning with one strange day a few months after my first and only meeting with him. One morning in the fall of 1999, I was in the kitchen enjoying my breakfast. My mother's voice could be heard in the other room talking on the phone. Within earshot, I heard her mention Steve's name. For a second, I was taken back to the time when we had met. I heard my mother hang up the phone, and shortly after she entered the kitchen. She appeared slightly off, but I did not think too much of it at the time. Spurred on by hearing Steve's name, I asked her how Steve was doing. He's not well," she replied. "How so?" I said, confused. She gingerly pulled out a chair beside me and sat down. Then she recounted what she had heard from May. In the previous evening, Steve did not come home for dinner. This was particularly odd since he was going to prepare dinner for his siblings. Concerned about his absence, his brother called him on his cell phone but was met with a voicemail greeting each time. By the time both of his parents had returned home from work, Steve was still missing. For hours the family waited. They were getting extremely anxious and worried that something horrible had happened to Steve. Then finally, the back entrance door swung open and there he was. A big sense of relief swept over the family, but that was short-lived as they quickly noticed that he was drenched from head to toe. It had been a clear day and that extended into the night without a drop of rain. Yet here Steve was, completely soaked. He slowly stumbled into the kitchen, puddles forming at his feet. His father, Ralph, reached out and gripped him by his shoulders and asked him what had happened and why was he soaking wet. Ralph's voice was emphatic, almost demanding his son to tell him who had done this to him so he could do something about it. And it was Steve's answer that left the family puzzled and frightened. Steve revealed that for the past few days he had been seeing a woman wherever he went. He saw her at work, on the streets, as he drove by in his car, at his girlfriend's place, everywhere. He described her to be of average height, dressed in a flowing white robe which contrasted her long straight black hair that was parted in the middle. Behind the hair was a face that haunted him. She was extremely ugly, he had described. She had dark eyes the size of small pills, giving her a sinister squint. And no matter which direction Steve had moved, it seemed he could not escape her horrid stare. Her nose was pushed back with barely any cartilage to support it. It looked like that of a skull's nose. Her face was long and gaunt, and wrapped around it was a slab of stretched-out pale white skin. There was barely any flesh on her face that it seemed her jagged cheekbones would pierce through her skin with the slightest quiver. But what terrified him most was her long gaping mouth. It was twisted in such a way that it looked perpetually like a half-sobbing cry and half a grotesque grin. This woman, Steve said, appeared at his workplace and told him that she was madly in love with him and that they had to be together forever. Every fiber in his body commanded him to run, but for some reason he could not. Despite his horror at even the slightest glance at the woman, Steve said he was completely under her spell. Thus, he left his workplace and followed her on foot. With every step he wanted to turn back and run, but he just could not overcome the force that the woman had over him. With her leading the way, they walked a great distance until they reached a remote lake. Once there, a force flung him into the shallow water and held his head underwater. Steve's limbs moved in every direction, thrashing at the waters. He wailed under the water, and at the brink of drowning he somehow was able to free himself from the force. He picked himself up from the water and immediately scanned his surroundings. The woman was gone. Steve spent the next hours walking home from the isolated lake. The fear and sadness in my mom's voice hung thick in the air around me as she told the story. "I can't believe it," she muttered. "Me too," I said. Growing up, my brothers and I were both fascinated and terrified by the supernatural. We were undoubtedly believers of spirits and the lot. So hearing this story confirmed my inkling that evil spirits are real. He has to get some hell. "Steve looks so mentally healthy to me," she said, cutting me off. "Wait. What?" I replied. "He always looked fine to me and never acted in a way that made me question whether perhaps he was developing a mental condition," she said. I was feeling incredulous at this point. "You think there is something wrong with him mentally?" my mother said. "Well, what else can it be? Steve's parents certainly think so." I still could not believe what I was hearing. How could the guy I had met just months earlier, the same guy who took care of his entire family, and had everything in his life so together, suddenly be deemed mentally unfit? But that was the conclusion that was drawn. It was all chalked up to Steve having a mental episode. All I knew was that it did not feel right to me. A few months passed without me hearing anything about Steve from my mother. My brothers and I had asked her about him at that time, but she refused to ask May about his well-being. This was mainly due to my mother not wanting to conjure up that frightful night, as May had moved on from it. Also, Steve was a son that May was so proud of. She would gladly talk about her son amongst her friends, and her admiration for him would radiate from her face. Now it was hard for her to talk about him in the same light, since he had his supposed mental episode. Eventually, we just stopped asking my mother altogether. Then one day in the winter of 1999, as if the months of normality were all too long, May and her family would be revisited by their hellish nightmare. It all began when May received a call from the police informing her to come to the hospital. "Your son was in an accident," the voice said. It did not provide any additional information. Operating on the assumption that her son was in a bad automobile accident, May and her youngest son, William, raced to the hospital. As one could imagine, she was an emotional wreck when she arrived. Her heart was racing a mile a minute, fearing that she would not see her son alive again. Once there, William was able to track down a nurse who directed them to an emergency room doctor. The doctor guided May into a chair before he began. "Your son," he said softly and slowly. "He had a really bad fall." "Fall? What do you mean? What happened?" May asked frantically. The doctor explained to her that a passerby had found Steve's limp body at the site of a condo building under construction. It was an off day for the construction workers, so no one was on site. The police believed that Steve had fallen multiple stories before landing on the dirt ground. The freezing cold had made the dirt ground very hard and unforgiving. Steve was alive, but unconscious when the passerby discovered him. He suffered multiple broken bones among his many serious injuries. It was not immediately known what had exactly happened and why Steve was even at the construction site. And with his range of injuries, which included a broken jaw in multiple places that required extensive wiring, it would stay that way for the coming days. My mother fought back tears when she described to me her visit to the hospital to see Steve. The mere sight of him struck her deep in her heart. He was a good-looking, physically fit young man in the prime of his life. And now he lay in a hospital bed, literally a broken version of his former self. In addition to his smashed jaw, he suffered breaks in his nose, collarbone, arm, and leg. The severity of his injuries was so great that the doctors did not believe he would make a full recovery. It was highly likely that he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life and not regain the full strength and mobility in his arm and upper torso. I remembered how much my mother had adored Steve, so I could only imagine what May and her family were going through. Several days had passed before my brothers and I asked our mother about the incident. I could tell by her face that she knew we would ask sooner or later. I had a feeling that she had known days earlier but was keeping it from us. This only confirmed my belief that it had something to do with the woman Steve had described earlier. Then one day, she finally told us. Steve had been doing well in the weeks immediately following the near-drowning incident, according to May. He settled back into his regular schedule and acted as if nothing had happened. But just as soon as the talk of the woman had vanished, it all came roaring back. Steve would go on and on about the woman to his family. He could see her from afar with her eyes locked on him. And no matter where he went, he could not escape her presence. "She would not leave me alone," he would say. But for whatever reason, be it simply not believing in what their son was claiming, having too much familial pride to admit their perfect son was not perfect anymore, fearing the stigma of having a mentally ill child, or Steve's own stubbornness to receive treatment, May and Ralph did not seek any help of any kind for Steve. On the day of the fall, the woman had again approached Steve and professed her love for him. She reiterated that he belonged to her, and that they had to be together for eternity. And just like before, no matter how much he had wanted to sprint in the opposite direction, his body betrayed him and followed the woman. This time she led him to a condo building in development, months from being complete. Like a puppet, his body moved under the control of someone or something else. She led him up the floors, and at every floor she twisted her head back at him and flashed that hideous grin of hers. All Steve could see was the blackness of her mouth sloping down into the dark abyss of her throat. He followed her to the highest level constructed, which was a dangerously high distance from the ground level. Unfortunately, the workers had the day off, and there was no one there to intervene. The woman led him to the ledge overlooking the city. She moved in close, inches from his face, and looked him right in the eyes. Pure sadistic joy oozed from her beady eyes. His entire body stiffened with fear. Then he felt a powerful force striking him from behind like being hit with an invisible wrecking ball. The last thing he remembered was plummeting straight down the building. The fear in my mother's voice was palpable as she told this to my brothers and me. She was shaking slightly and tried to hide it. To the shock of us all, my mother then said, "What if he really is being haunted by a spirit?" The hairs on my arms and neck stood up even straighter. Somehow the fact that my mother finally acknowledged the possibility of an evil spirit being behind Steve's torment frightened me. All this time she had stood firmly on the belief that Steve was mentally ill. She was the counterweight to my brothers and my belief that an evil spirit was the root cause of all this. She was beginning to see things our way, and it was unnerving. After the fall, Steve adjusted to life with physical handicaps the best he could, which was not any good at all. He required a crutch to walk, and even with its support he walked with a noticeable limp. The loss of strength in his arm meant he could no longer return to work. I could only imagine how hard a pill it was to swallow for him. He was a man capable of so much and had achieved so much. His family had depended greatly on him. Now he depended on them. May had recounted to my mother a time when she dined out with Steve and his girlfriend. Steve struggled tremendously with feeding himself, though he was adamant on doing it without any help. He was able to use his better arm and hand to scoop up his food. But his mouth presented a problem. His jaw had been so badly damaged that after the wiring was removed, he could not open his mouth fully to receive his food. Food had smeared all over his face as he struggled to shove it into his own mouth. Feeling sorry for him, Steve's girlfriend took over the task and helped guide the food into his mouth. Then chewing itself became a problem as his jowls did not line up straight as they once did. His mandibles came together crooked, unable to fully break down the food. This only made it harder for him to swallow. The other diners in the restaurant started incessantly at Steve as he ate. They were completely unaware of what they were doing and the disrespect they exuded without uttering a word. But Steve was well aware of all the eyes on him and the reason for it. Anger, humiliation, sadness, fear, these are some things I imagine Steve to be feeling at that moment. He dropped his utensils, wiped his mouth clean, and stopped eating. He stared straight down at nothing in particular for the rest of their time in the restaurant. May feared that he would soon crumble under the weight of the indignity he faced every single day. May's fear came to fruition as the something terrible my mother alluded to at the beginning of the story occurred on one tragic day in the fall of 2000. It was late in the afternoon, and the entire house was silent as everyone but William and Steve were out. William sat quietly in his room, studiously doing his homework. He welcomed the silence as it was difficult to focus on schoolwork at times with 5 other people in the house. The silence was ripped apart by a loud bang William later described to be a door slamming. When the sound registered in William's brain, his immediate thought was to check on his brother. He sprinted from his room and flew down the stairs to the basement where he knew Steve was. Steve was nowhere to be found. He was never seen or heard from again. Steve's popularity, which my mother boasted about, was evident during his vigil, or memorial, or whatever that was, a gathering of people to remember him, to keep the hope alive that he would return. A large turnout of young people joined Steve's family. Many in the group mourned. My mother was one of many who was unable to contain herself and contributed to the wailing cries that enveloped the somber gathering. The sadness felt on that day equaled the shock of a young man, in his prime, disappearing. I know at this juncture in the story there are a handful of readers who are confused by my submission of this story. To them, this story sounds nothing more than a man struggling with a burgeoning case of mental problems, and then ultimately losing his mind. But to those readers, I offer a peculiar episode that happened shortly before Steve began seeing the woman who had haunted him. Steve had taken a trip to Thailand with a couple of his friends. One day, Steve suggested to his friends that they should visit a Buddhist temple. His friends considered this to be a bit odd given that not one of them was Buddhist, or religious, for that matter. However, they conceded that they wanted to experience the culture of the land. Shortly after they entered the temple, Steve's behavior changed. He appeared completely enamored with the place. He became very quiet and stoic. He strolled the grounds as if he was familiar with the place, and started praying like a monk. This was very strange for a Westerner who had no previous exposure to Buddhist teachings. Things only got stranger after he returned home. He began talking to his family and close friends about praying with him. He often preached about how peaceful he felt during his time praying in the temple. May and Ralph found themselves to be very uncomfortable as they were not religious people and certainly did not raise their kids to be as such. This obsessive behavior of Steve's for his newfound passion was soon purged by the advent of the woman. To this day, many are of the belief that Steve succumbed to his mental problems. This is the belief that his mind went off the rails. But I ask, what if? What if Steve was right the whole time? What if there really was an evil spirit that longed for his soul? What if the woman was standing right in front of him, gleefully knowing that she would soon have him, as he stepped out of his house against his will? Because as soon as those people can ask themselves what if, they can begin to acknowledge that perhaps Steve's dread and suffering was not so much the woman herself, but the fact that she was real, and no one believed him.
If you're loving listening to us so far, subscribe, like, and rate us. Also follow us across our other podcast platforms on our bio. Thanks. Let's get into the summary for those of us who missed out in some parts of the stories.
Okay, so before we get ahead of ourselves, let's dive into the first story, The Man in the Dog Suit. This one is, well, it's pretty unsettling, to say the least.
Yeah, just the title alone is enough to make you a little uneasy.
Right, so we've got a 13-year-old girl named Sydney who's dealing with a truly horrifying situation. Imagine losing your beloved dog.
Awful.
I know, and then having it replaced by a man wearing her skin.
Okay, no, that's just creepy.
It's a deeply disturbing image, and what makes it even worse is that Sydney's the only one who sees the truth. Her family is completely oblivious, going about their lives as if nothing is wrong.
That kind of isolation can really amplify the horror.
Oh, absolutely. It's like being trapped in a nightmare that no one else can see. And the story is filled with these little details that just scream something is wrong. Like the man makes these awkward movements, his voice is deep and gruff, nothing like her dog Honey's bark. And he does things that a dog would never do, like digging in the backyard with his bare hands.
I mean, even if you didn't suspect something was seriously wrong, that's just not normal behavior.
Not at all. And then there's the discovery of Honey's old collar torn and bloodied hidden in the backyard.
Oh, God.
It's just the violence it's never explicitly stated, which makes it even more unsettling.
So many questions like, what really happened to the real Honey? Where did this man come from? And what does he want?
Exactly. And the story just ends. We don't know Sydney's fate or what happens next.
Oh, wow. So it just leaves you hanging like that.
It does. And I think that abrupt ending is really effective. It forces us, the listeners, to confront the possibility that there are no easy answers, no happy endings when it comes to these kinds of encounters.
It's that lingering sense of unease that really sticks with you.
It's like the story is saying that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones we don't understand, the ones that leave us with more questions than answers.
I think that's a really powerful message.
Okay, so let's move on to the next story. Red Glowing Eyes. This one takes place in a classic horror setting, a dark, isolated basement.
Oh, basements are always creepy.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with a good basement setting for a horror story. So in this story, a woman wakes up in the middle of the night to find a figure resembling her boyfriend staring at her with glowing red eyes.
I mean, talk about a nightmare come to life.
Right. And the fact that her actual boyfriend is sound asleep right next to her makes it even more unsettling.
Definitely adds another layer of creepiness.
So what do you make of those glowing red eyes? It's such a common motif in horror stories and folklore.
It is a really common motif. You know, those glowing eyes often represent something demonic or malevolent. It's like a visual cue that immediately tells us this is something to be feared.
Yeah, it's like our brains are hardwired to be afraid of that kind of imagery.
Right. But it also raises the question, why choose that particular form? Is it meant to intimidate, to deceive, or something else entirely?
It's like the entity is trying to tap into our deepest fears.
Playing on our primal instincts.
Exactly. All right, let's move on to the next story, The Vanishing Figure. This one comes from a teenager in Portugal who keeps seeing a tall, dark figure lurking in the corner of his eye.
Okay, so like a shadow person?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
At first, it's just fleeting glimpses, but the encounters escalate, culminating in a terrifying moment where the figure seems to try and reach for him.
Oh, wow. That's intense.
Yeah, and what makes this story really interesting is the cultural element. The teenager eventually goes to see an old man who performs a prayer to dispel the entity.
So it's like different cultures have different ways of dealing with these kinds of encounters.
Exactly. It's like different cultures have different rule books for dealing with the supernatural.
Yeah.
And that adds another layer of mystery to these encounters.
So then what are the rules, and how do we know if we're breaking them?
That's a great question. And I don't think there's an easy answer. You know, it's like we're navigating a hidden world with its own set of customs and dangers. And that brings us back to the question of why this teenager was targeted in the first place. Was it random, or was there something specific about him that drew this entity's attention?
Almost like he accidentally stumbled into something he shouldn't have.
Right, like he crossed a boundary he didn't even know existed.
That's a creepy thought.
Okay, so we've talked about creatures wearing dog skins, spectral figures with glowing eyes, and shadowy figures lurking in the periphery. Now let's move on to something a little different, a shared nightmare.
Okay, I'm intrigued. These shared dream stories always get me thinking.
Me too. They're so fascinating and unsettling. In this story, two sisters have the exact same dream about a menacing black hat man who appears in their sister's workplace, which happens to be a Cracker Barrel.
Cracker Barrel. That's such an unexpected setting for a nightmare.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's such a mundane setting, which makes the dream all the more unsettling. Like you wouldn't expect something so sinister to be lurking in a place like that.
Definitely adds to the creep factor.
Yeah, and they describe this incredibly vivid imagery. The man's appearance, his ability to speak in tongues, and the intense fear he evoked. And their mother's reaction adds another layer of creepiness. Even though she didn't have the dream herself, she urges her daughter to quit her job, like she intuitively senses something is wrong.
It's almost as if the dream tapped into something beyond just their imaginations.
Right, like it reached out and touched their waking lives as well.
You know, that reminds me of the changeling myth that's so common in folklore. It's that idea that something we trust, something intimate, can be replaced by a hostile imposter. Sydney's story taps into that primal fear, doesn't it? It makes you wonder, where does that fear originate?
It's a fear of the unknown, of something infiltrating our lives and corrupting what we hold dear. That feeling of something's not right, but not being able to put your finger on it. I think that's what resonates with so many people when it comes to paranormal experiences.
Absolutely. It's a fear that's woven into the fabric of our collective unconscious, a fear that speaks to our vulnerability and the fragility of our reality.
Okay, so we've covered 4 pretty intense stories so far. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you the most? Which story has kind of resonated with you on a deeper level?
That's a tough one. They're all so different but equally disturbing. You know, I think what's really striking me is how each story plays on our most basic fears. Whether it's the fear of the unknown, the fear of losing someone we love, or the fear of something sinister invading our lives.
Yeah, and there's also that common thread of isolation that runs through all of these stories. These people are experiencing these terrifying things, but no one believes them, or they're afraid to tell anyone what they're going through.
Right, it's like they're trapped in their own personal nightmares.
And that sense of isolation can be just as terrifying as the paranormal experiences themselves.
I think that's what makes these stories so compelling. They tap into something very real and very human, that fear of being alone, of not being understood.
And that's something we can all relate to on some level.
Exactly. It's a universal experience that transcends time and culture.
All right, so before we move on to our final story, let's take a quick break to gather our thoughts. And when we come back, we'll delve into the last tale of the night. All right, so we're back and ready to dive into our 5th story. You know, as we were discussing those first few stories, I kept thinking about the objects we surround ourselves with every day. We had that story about Honey's bloody collar, and now we're moving on to a story called The Haunted Spear.
Interesting.
Yeah. This story takes us to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it revolves around a spear found at the site of a historical tragedy, the Tulsa race riots.
Wow, so there's a historical element to this one.
Yeah, and it adds a whole other layer of complexity to the story. This spear is believed to be haunted, and the story follows a woman recounting her grandmother's chilling experiences with it.
So like a family heirloom passed down through generations.
Exactly. And the grandmother describes all sorts of unsettling things happening. There were knocking sounds coming from the spear, and it mysteriously moved around the house even though no one touched it.
Like it had a life of its own.
Yeah. And the fact that it was found at the site of such a horrific event, the Tulsa race riots, makes you wonder if the spear is somehow connected to the trauma and violence of that event.
Right, like maybe it absorbed some of the negative energy from that tragedy.
Exactly. And that raises the question of whether the activity was intended to harm the grandmother or perhaps to draw attention to the historical tragedy connected to the spear.
That's a chilling thought. Could it be that the victims of the riots were seeking some form of acknowledgement or justice?
It's definitely a possibility. And it makes you think about the objects we have in our own homes. What have they witnessed? What stories could they tell if they could talk?
It's fascinating, isn't it? The idea that we're surrounded by this hidden history, this invisible world of energy and emotion that we might only glimpse through these paranormal encounters.
And it makes you wonder if we should be treating these objects with more respect, especially if they might be holding on to the energy of past events, especially those marked by trauma and violence.
That's a really interesting ethical question. Like, do we have a responsibility to the objects themselves? Or is it more about respecting the history they represent?
That's a great point. I think it's probably a combination of both. You know, we need to be mindful of the stories these objects carry and the people whose lives they've touched.
It's like each object has its own unique history, its own energy signature.
Okay, so let's move on to our final story for the night. This one is called The Disappearance. And it's about a man named Steve who goes on a trip to Thailand and visits a Buddhist temple. Seems harmless enough, right?
Yeah, sounds like a pretty typical vacation experience.
And after that trip, things take a dark turn He starts being haunted by the apparition of a grotesque woman who claims to be in love with him.
Oh, wow. So not your typical love story.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And this entity is persistent. It constantly intrudes on Steve's life. He can't escape it no matter where he goes or what he does.
So it's like a stalker, but from beyond the grave.
Exactly. And as the story progresses, we see the toll this haunting takes on Steve. He starts to withdraw from his friends and family. His mental and physical health deteriorates, and he becomes increasingly isolated.
It's like the haunting is slowly consuming him.
Yeah, it's really tragic. And in the end, Steve disappears without a trace. We're left with no explanation, no closure. It's like he vanished into thin air.
So the mystery remains unsolved.
It does. And it makes you wonder what really happened to him. Did the entity finally claim him? Or did he find a way to escape? We may never know.
It's a reminder that sometimes there are no easy answers when it comes to the paranormal.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground tonight. We've talked about historical trauma, haunted objects, cultural boundaries, and the psychological impact of paranormal experiences. But there's one more theme that I want to touch on before we wrap things up.
Okay, I'm listening.
And that's the theme of isolation. That feeling of being alone, of not being believed when you're experiencing something truly terrifying.
Yeah, that's a recurring theme in a lot of these stories.
It is. And I think it's one of the most disturbing aspects of the paranormal. It's that sense of being trapped in your own nightmare with no one to turn to.
Because even if you do try to tell someone, they might not believe you, or they might think you're crazy.
Exactly. And that can be just as terrifying as the paranormal experiences themselves.
It can make you question your own sanity, your own grip on reality.
And that's why it's so important to create spaces where people feel safe sharing their experiences without fear of judgment or ridicule.
Absolutely. We need to be open to the possibility that there's more to reality than we can see or comprehend.
And we need to be willing to listen to each other's stories with empathy and compassion.
Because sometimes just being heard can make all the difference.
Okay, so before we wrap things up, I want to ask you one final question.
Sure.
Do you think these stories have changed your perspective on the paranormal at all? Have they made you question your own beliefs or assumptions?
You know, I think they have. They've definitely made me more open to the possibility that there are things out there that we don't understand, things that defy our logic and reason.
And what about you? Have these stories challenged your own beliefs?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, I've always been fascinated by the paranormal, but these stories have definitely made me think more deeply about the nature of reality and the limits of our conception.
That's really interesting to hear. And I think that's the power of these stories. They force us to confront the unknown and to question everything we thought we knew about the world.
They remind us that we're not always in control, and that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones we can't explain.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. But the conversation doesn't end here. I encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep an open mind to the possibilities that lie beyond our everyday perceptions.
And don't be afraid to share your own stories, because every encounter, every whispered tale adds another piece to the puzzle of the paranormal.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the mysteries of the unknown. All right, so we've talked about a lot in this deep dive about all these paranormal stories. We've discussed the psychological impact and the cultural interpretations and those historical echoes and that feeling like something's just not right. But now I want to kind of circle back to something you mentioned earlier about making sense of the unknown.
Yeah, that's a big one, right at the core of it all, I think. It's what makes it both terrifying and fascinating at the same time.
Right. It's that push and pull. You know, we as humans, we want explanations. We want to find those patterns and meaning in the chaos. But these paranormal things, they just don't fit neatly into categories.
Exactly. They mess with our worldviews, force us to kind of confront the limits of what we know.
And that can be really unsettling. It can take Sydney's story, for example, the man in the dog suit. There are so many questions we're left with. What happened to Honey the dog? What does that man even want? Is he a shapeshifter, a demon, something else entirely we just don't know?
And that not knowing, that ambiguity, just makes it even scarier.
It does, because it plays on that primal fear, that fear of the unknown. We like to think we're in control, but these stories, they remind us that maybe we're not, that there might be forces out there we can't even comprehend.
Forces outside our everyday experience.
Exactly. And that uncertainty, it makes us question what we see, what we believe, even our own sanity. Like in Red Glowing Eyes. Was it really a ghost she saw? Or was it a hallucination? The story doesn't tell us. We have to decide for ourselves.
And that's what keeps us engaged. It's not just passively listening, it's actively thinking and imagining and wrestling with those open questions.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Talk about that haunted spear for a minute. That story really stuck with me. That whole concept of residual energy, like objects holding on to emotions from the past, especially trauma and violence.
It's a powerful idea. It pops up in so many cultures, those sacred relics, haunted battlefields, places where history seems to bleed into the present.
It makes you wonder what kind of energy our own things are holding on to.
Right.
Our old photographs, antique furniture, those little souvenirs we pick up.
What stories could they tell?
And speaking of stories, we can't forget about Steve, the man who vanished after his trip to Thailand. That story is a harsh reminder that the paranormal isn't always just spooky fun. It can have real consequences, affect people's lives, their relationships, their sense of self.
Steve's story shows us we have to take these experiences seriously, even if we don't understand them. Brushing them off as delusions, that can be dangerous. People might not get the help they need.
And it highlights how important it is to create a space where people feel safe to share these experiences without being judged. We need to be open-minded, empathetic, curious about the unknown.
I completely agree. When we approach these topics with respect and a willingness to listen, we can learn so much about ourselves, our history, and this vast, mysterious world we live in.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into these paranormal stories. We've explored fear, isolation, cultural beliefs, historical echoes, and that constant struggle to make sense of what we don't know. But this isn't the end of the conversation. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep an open mind to those possibilities that exist beyond what we see every day. And most importantly, share your own stories, because each encounter, each whispered tale, adds another piece to the puzzle of the paranormal. Thanks for joining us.